Hi there and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Tonight I want to talk about an extraordinary moment in the kind of 18 months to 2 years after the end of the Second World War. And that's this explosion of female suffrage and female political activism, not just in the United States and Great Britain and First World countries, which is something we're part of the narrative that we're kind of aware of, but really around the globe, from places as diverse as Iran and Egypt and the Philippines, and the kind of the reasons for this. And you see this kind of from the wealthy countries of the world, the victorious countries who had won the war, to the defeated countries, to countries that had been affected by the war. They'd either supplied labour or resources, or they'd been occupied. The scope of this wave of female empowerment and politics is quite extraordinary and really, really diverse, which is why I wanted to talk about it. This is a very interesting phenomena. And one can, the uniting factor throughout all of these countries is the mobilization or that the war brings. Even countries where the country wasn't a kind of a direct combatant. Again, for example, a country like Egypt that was where Allied armies fought over Egyptian territory, though Egypt itself wasn't on either side during the conflict, or not kind of more than nominally. But the population was mobilised by the effect of the war. The female labour was mobilised as never before, and required by the Allied powers. And war industries were stimulated. And it's even where you don't have female combatants or women who were mobilised militarily, everywhere, almost everywhere, you have a mass mobilisation of female labour. And this seems to be the uniting factor. So we're going to look at Keith Lowe's brilliant book. If you haven't read it, get The Fear and the Freedom, Why the Second World War Still Matters. It's a stupendously good piece of historical writing, and it's a really an examination, particularly in this instance, of the rise and the fall of women's political engagement by the late 1940s and into the 1950s. So Keith Lowe writes, "The Second World War was an awakening for women all around the world. Wherever there was fighting, women not only supported their menfolk but often fought alongside them. In France, as well as serving on committees, they were liaison agents, arms smugglers, explosive experts, spies, propagandists, fighters and assassins." Obviously this is in the French resistance. "It was organisations staffed and headed by women that rescued Jewish children by transporting them to Switzerland or to remote areas of the Haute-Loire. The co-founder of the combat movement was the feminist campaigner Bertie Albrecht. The Liberation Sud movement was co-founded by Lucie Aubrac, who famously rescued her husband from the Gestapo in a vicious gun battle, despite being pregnant at the time. Women in the resistance carried out all the same roles as men, and when they were caught, they often suffered exactly the same fate: torture, imprisonment, execution. This pattern was reproduced across Europe, where the participation of women was far greater than in France. In Italy, according to figures, more than 25% of the resistance members were women, including 35,000 who took an active combat role. In Poland, there were 40,000 women members of the clandestine Home Army, and in Yugoslavia, up to 100,000 women became soldiers in Tito's National Liberation Army. In Asia too, women played a huge role in the Hook resistance against the Japanese rule in the Philippines, as well as in the Indonesian defiance against both the Japanese and the Dutch. Among the major Allied nations, hundreds of thousands of women were employed as nurses, naval auxiliaries, and Air Force auxiliaries. The Soviet forces included more than 500,000 women who saw active service at the front. So it's interesting in the case of Indonesia there that you have women and of course men involved in two anti-colonial struggles, the anti-Japanese one and the anti-Dutch anti-colonial struggle, with even some involvement by Great Britain as well. But war is not only about fighting, and women prove themselves in many other ways. In France, with 1.5 million French soldiers in captivity, women began to run not only the nation's households, but also many of its farms and small businesses. I guess one of the things that the war does is it disrupts the patterns of everyday life in occupied countries, in non-occupied countries. Even in Axis countries, women were called upon to contribute in ways that they had never done before by mid to late in the war. And so what this does is, after the war, in some places, not everywhere, but in some places, it presents historic opportunities for women and other oppressed or minority groups to be able to exercise some of the gains that they've made during the war, and to take advantage of the chaos that the war that the war presents. French factories thronged with women, and in 1942 there were so many women working in the French railways that the prefect of Toulouse complained that female clerks were beginning to outnumber male ones. The same was true in many countries. Millions of women who'd never worked before became land girls and office girls and factory workers in every kind of industry. In the USA, a new image of female strength was glamorized in wartime propaganda. Rosie the Riveter, who built the aircraft and the Liberty ships that kept the country fighting. Because of the war, the myth of the passive, housebound woman was undermined almost everywhere. According to the former resistance fighter Denise Breton, the atmosphere of hope and transformation generated by the end of the war in France created a new woman, accustomed to standing up for her rights and determined to change the world. Others, like René Caire-Ferrier, claimed that it had also created a new kind of man, particularly in resistance circles. The partnership with women changed the mentality of men in the resistance, he wrote. They showed themselves to be our equals. At the same time, the myth of the heroic man was also undermined, particularly in those parts of the world where men had failed to live up to the stereotype. Among the many defeats of the war, wrote one Berlin woman in 1945, is the defeat of the male sex. Some women in wartime France appear to have felt the same way. Marguerite Gonnet, the mother of 9, was arrested in 1942 for leading a resistance cell in the Isère. When asked by the military tribunal why she had taken up arms, she replied, "Quite simply, Colonel, because the men had dropped them." I guess there's a sort of like a slightly interesting parallel if you look at the experience of the coronavirus. Almost everywhere in the world, certain old certainties particularly about how we live, how we work, and how we function as a society, whether you're talking about Great Britain or China or France or America or wherever else. These certainties have been shaken. The extent to which older values towards work and leisure and money and all the other stuff, consumerism, all these kinds of things, and probably a whole bunch of stuff around gender. The extent to which these old values reassert themselves, it remains to be seen. Maybe they'll be very successful in doing so and we'll all go back to the way we lived. I suspect not. However, there was a concerted effort, as we will see, in many parts of the world to return particular patriarchal control back to kind of its sort of pre-war status quo. Keith Lowe writes, "In such an atmosphere, it's not surprising that women felt a new confidence after the war, or that so many brand new women's organisations started up around the world. In Egypt, there was a newly formed Bint el Nil, Daughters of the Nile, which campaigned for changes to the law that made women subordinate to their husbands and fathers. In 1951, a group of around 1,500 women even stormed the parliament building. In Indonesia, there was Geris, another brand new women's organisation which coordinated boycotts and mass demonstrations for all kinds of causes, including an end to polygamy. Meanwhile, the Federation of Brazilian Women, started in 1949, campaigned not only for equal pay, but also for the right to clean water, adequate food and housing. Back in France, Françoise Leclerc's UFF was soon joined by the new international movement, the Women's International Democratic Federation, formed in Paris in 1945 by women from 40 countries. It would grow to become one of the most influential women's organisations in the post-war world." So, one of the ways that we sort of tend to think, or the ways that we tend to teach women's movements, is that after World War II, sort of nothing really happened until the 1960s, and then people like Betty Friedan, and then later on Germaine Greer, and a generation from the sort of the 60s to the 70s of activists pointed out that women were oppressed, and all of a sudden, sort of things kind of occur, and it's a very Anglo-American centric story. But when you hear of, at the end of the Second World War, Egyptian, Brazilian, Indonesian women's movements demanding the sorts of radical changes. I mean, they're not actually particularly radical changes. Wanting clean water is not a radical thing to want, but an end to polygamy. But in the context of the time, it's quite radical. And these are organised, highly motivated, and well-led insurrections in some cases against patriarchal control. It really does sort of disrupt that kind of rather complacent Western sense that we have about where sort of the second wave of feminism sort of stems from. In all of these cases, of course, there's a swift and massive reaction against them, and many of these struggles are unfortunately crushed. On the back of all this activity and the occasional dramatic transformations in the public in public opinion that came with it, women began to win all kinds of new rights for themselves. Foremost amongst them was the right to vote. In many parts of Europe, this right had already been won in the aftermath of the First World War, but in France, women were not granted the vote until 1944. The role played by women in resistance was used as a justification. If women could fight alongside men, the argument went, then they should at least have a say in whether their nation went to war in the first place. Shortly after French women were granted the vote, full suffrage was also extended to women in Italy and Yugoslavia in 1945, Malta in 1947, Belgium in 1948, Greece in 1952. If there is any doubt that these advances resulted directly from the Second World War, consider that women from neutral Switzerland did not win full suffrage until 1971, and women in neutral Portugal had to wait until 1976. In Asia, the story was the same. Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Indonesian women all won full voting rights in the 1940s. Meanwhile, the only Latin American and Caribbean countries to grant universal suffrage before the war were Brazil, Uruguay, and Cuba. but during and after the war, almost all the others quickly followed suit. Paraguay was the last, holding out until 1961. The rights of women were also finally recognised on an international level in 1945 by the United Nations. The UN Charter opens with a declaration of intent not only to save the world from future wars, but also to promote the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. By 1946, a UN Commission on the status of women had already been set up, which would play a significant role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This landmark document, published in 1948, finally spelled out how all members of the human family should be afforded the same rights, dignity and worth. On the face of it, therefore, the stage appeared to be set for a new era in which women who had grown up without fundamental rights might at last begin to take their rightful place in the economic, political and social life of the world. The hopes that were expressed by many women in France and across the world were unashamedly utopian. Even Simone de Beauvoir, the sort of pioneering French feminist philosopher, whose savage criticisms of French patriarchy pulled no punches, allowed herself to dream of a time in the not-too-distant future where men and women would see each other as equals and unequivocally affirm their brotherhood. So here we have this interesting moment where things appear as if they might be taking a kind of a step towards massive kind of emancipatory gains, massive sorts of egalitarian moves forward. Obviously, whilst there was no doubt correspondence between many of these movements, there is little coordination. Most things are done at a national level, and even if that wasn't the case, the chances of being able to withstand a prolonged onslaught from a national government, particularly a patriarchal one, is pretty unlikely. In most instances, you have, or in a great many instances, you have newly emancipated nations that have either thrown off the occupation of the Axis powers, or they are countries in the late 1940s and 1950s that are emerging from French, British, Dutch, Belgian colonialism into independence. In many of these countries, you have strong nationalist movements, very often male-led nationalist movements, who they say, we've kicked out the foreigners, we've got our country back, we're looking after our own affairs, and we are now going to kind of reorganise things in a broadly patriarchal way. And I think that's one reason why you have this wave of retrenchment. But there are other reasons as well. Emancipatory politics of any stripe isn't particularly desired by male politicians as countries around the world decide which side of the Cold War they're going to be on. And also the weakening of patriarchal control that the war brought about, being defeated and occupied by Germany or Japan, or having setbacks like the fall of Singapore, for male politicians and soldiers is a profoundly emasculating affair. And the reassertion of masculine power needed to be kind of unconditionally understood at the end of the war. So, Keith Lowe writes, unfortunately, this was where the progress towards equality ground to a halt. Nowhere was this more apparent than France, given the huge transformations that took place there as a result of the war. It's tempting to portray the French as a nation of firebrands, but in reality the forces of conservatism were every bit as strong as the forces of revolution. It was all very well for the resistance members to champion women's rights, but much of the rest of French society, which had merely kept its collective head down during the occupation, wanted only for the world to return to the way it had been before the war. When French prisoners of war returned home in 1945, they expected to resume their positions as head of the family, regardless of how well their wives had run things in their absence. Women were too often relieved to be able to return to the traditional roles they had grown up with, rather than struggling to invent new functions for themselves in public life. They were tired of the conflict and wanted to return to a normal life. That's an important point to acknowledge as well, that there were plenty of women who didn't want to have to be the kind of model of the modern woman that we imagine, and were happy to return to domestic life because it was easier. And it often depends on how comfortable an existence that is, because it's not necessarily comfortable for everybody, materially or emotionally, but if it was, there was something attractive in that, especially after periods of extreme hardship. Nor is it strictly true to suggest that the majority of men in the resistance regarded their female counterparts as equals. Jean Bohec, the experienced female explosives expert in Saint-Marcel, complained that she was quickly sidelined as soon as young men began to join the Force Française de l'Intérieur, the FFI. She wanted to take part in the liberation, but was told politely to forget about it. A woman isn't supposed to fight when so many men are available. Yet surely I knew how to use a submachine gun better than a lot of the FFI volunteers who had just got hold of these arms. In Italy, female partisans were often banned from taking part in triumphal march pasts after the liberation. Those who did were often branded whores. As the war drew to an end, the pressures for women to return to traditional roles were often irresistible. Churches, governments, schools, and even the brand new women's magazines like Elle and Marie France that first appeared on the market after the war all exhorted women to return to the home. In August 1946, one woman wrote to Elle explaining her desire to take a job against her fiancé's wishes. The magazine told her bluntly, "Your fiancé is right. The place of the married woman is at home," before going on to suggest that if she was unwilling to bow to her fiancé's wishes, then perhaps she did not truly love him after all. Women must create happiness, claimed another magazine. Create happiness, claimed another magazine. She will do this best in her home. The home and only the home is a true professional milieu. At school, girls were taught with textbooks that told them explicitly that true happiness was in the home, and that a woman's absence from the home weakens family life. The government, meanwhile, exhorted women to get back not only indoors, but into the bedroom, as increased birth rates was announced as a national priority. And all kinds of benefits, including tax breaks and extra rations, were announced for mothers. De Gaulle himself proclaimed that he wanted 12 million new babies to help with the reconstruction of France. According to Robert Prigent, the Minister of Population and Public Health immediately after the war, women's true fulfillment lay in accepting their feminine nature and devoting themselves to the homes of their children. So there's a whole bunch to say about that, and these kind of natalist policies, which were not just the preserve of fascist states at all, and the idea that there must be a kind of like a drive for national rejuvenation after the horrors of the war, and that women and childbirth would be one of the ways that you could do that. But also, particularly in France, the shame and the humiliation of the defeat and occupation haunted particularly French men after the war, and the ideas amongst many of them, whilst there were some egalitarian former resistance people, many men felt that their sense of kind of masculine pride had been undermined and needed to be restored. And restoring traditional empowered conservative ideas of masculinity and femininity, empowering for men anyway, was one way to do it. And you find a version of this around the world. You don't really see a resurgence of popular feminism internationally, of course, until the 1960s. After 2 decades of rising living standards and social change and cultural change and increased education and educational and work opportunities for women, you see this second wave of feminism around the mid to late 60s and the 1970s. And the kind of the restoration of patriarchal control in many countries is very successful in the 1940s. It would be nice to say that there was some sort of generational connection between the two, but I've yet to see evidence that sort of somehow these women's struggles in the 1940s directly inspired the women's struggles of the late 1960s. They seem to have they seem to be the product of other forces. Okay, there we're going to finish. We've got some great interviews coming up in the next few weeks, some really exciting stuff I want to announce, but I won't do yet because you want to things can always be cancelled last minute and you wind up looking a bit stupid. Still putting new content on explaininghistory.org, so do check it out. I'll put a link down in the show notes. Week by week, I'm adding to the Russian history syllabus on there, and then we'll probably move on to Germany or the USA, or depends what I decide. Anyway, I hope you found this useful. Thanks very much for your time, and thanks very much for everyone who supports the Explaining History podcast.